First of all, I want to welcome Hazel. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us tonight. I'm looking forward to this session and I'm looking forward to learning from you as well. If you will allow me, I'm going to start with a little story. And then what we're going to do is a fireside chat concept. I'm not presenting a lot tonight. I'm going to ask a lot of things, but unlike usual where I get to talk a lot, that's not going to happen. That's Hazel's job. And I hope pleasure tonight as well. And there's a reason for that. When I did my PhD quite some time ago, the reality was I didn't have these type of situations. I didn't actually have a formal annual review. What it was for me was about a year into my journey, my supervisor, who was actually the pro vice chancellor of the university, so no pressure there, had his secretary email me with a, "Oh, Craig, could you give me an update and let me know if you have any problems? Thanks." And that was it. So I wrote back a sort of an email with some things, and that was deemed my annual review. That I didn't at the time think anything of it because I didn't know any better. And it was simply, okay, this is what I'm asked, I'm doing. I email the guy once in a while. We have a conversation here and there. That was just like, oh, ticking a box, okay. But I never got the opportunity to do sort of the formal annual reviews that is becoming more prevalent in academia. So for that reason, I'm only going to ask questions. And I'm going to start off, with a question for you, Hazel. Can you sort of share a bit about your experience of advising doctoral candidates through the annual review process, and maybe a little bit about what your personal approach to helping counsel PhD candidates is like?
Okay. Hi, Craig, and hi, everyone. It's nice to be here tonight, and it's nice to see some familiar names as well in the crowd. Hey, so just like Craig, there's a little bit of disclaimer. I also didn't go through what they call a traditional research PhD, like most of you would be going through now. I went to a taught PhD, so I also didn't have what you call a traditional annual review, but we did have what we call a proposal at the start of our so it's almost like an annual review, but it happens halfway to your research, right? So but having said that, I moved to a British system 17 years ago, which is a more traditional type wherein you do annual reviews every year for your first year, second year, and third year. So in my case, I've been supervising PhD students since 2011. I think that was the first time we opened a PhD program. And I guess the most practical thing that I tell my students at the first and foremost is find out what are the required forms. Sometimes we have to start with this kind of little step. What are the required forms that you have to fill out? We call them the boring side of the annual review, but you need them. So you need to fill out those forms, think about your timelines. And as a supervisor, I also would walk my student into who their reviewers would be. So normally an annual review consists of an internal reviewer from the university and the supervisors. The supervisors are just there to give you moral support, but we're not really doing anything, like we are just watching from a distance. I do have some students in the past who would actually request that I don't sit in their annual review because it makes them more nervous. Okay, but in general, I prepare my students the same way as I would prepare them for their own vivas 3 years down the line. To see the annual review as an opportunity to kind of check where you are, what you're doing, and see it as a kind of both a constructive experience, but also an experience to, really improve upon what you're doing.
Fantastic. What would you say are briefly the key considerations for a doctoral candidate as they prepare for the review from their own side? What do they have to think through? What
So
sort
I
of
think like
processes?
maybe we could start off with like the first annual review. So for most students, the first year review is almost I guess the hardest because you have no baseline, right? And usually for university, it's also coinciding with what you call your confirmation review. So it confirms your status as a PhD student, whether you meet the basic requirements of how it means to move forward with the PhD or be reclassified as a potential master's by research student. Okay, so a key consideration at the first year review is that do you have a clear idea of what is it that you want to study? You know, so a clear research question in mind. Have you gone through, you know, the reading of the literature, for instance? So for students at Nottingham, for example, a requirement in the first year review that you have to really look into is a mini literature review. You know, so it's not going to be your final literature review for the thesis, but your reviewer would like to know, have you understand what are the gaps available there in the literature? In the second and third years, it's more about checking your progress. Okay, so the annual review often starts with the question of what have you done since our last review, and kind of check. Okay, so and each student would have a different pathway in terms of what they've gone through. So some students might be faster in year two and then slow down a bit as well. Okay, so it is important that you know your reviewers understand to what extent have you made progress since the last part of the review. The third year review kind of tells whether you should now go to what we call thesis pending period, or do you need an extra year to continue with your study and do some more? Yeah.
You know, you kind of mentioned, you sort of hinted at the beaver a little bit earlier, and I'm just going to throw a question and I didn't prepare you for. But, you know, when we go to defend our dissertation, we do a presentation and then we do Q&A and all of that. How does that model work for an annual review? Should a candidate have a little presentation prepared, or should they be ready, kind of like, you know, us earlier today? Are we going to do a presentation? Or are we going to do a fireside chat? Should a candidate, you know, have the same internal discussion with themselves? Do they get something presented, or do they say, you know what? Let's go in ready to talk about it, and then as we handle questions. What's your perspective on that, please?
For me personally, I'd rather not have a presentation. I'd rather have a more chat. That was our old approach in my school. We didn't have like a formal presentation, but more of like, what are your goals? How have you attained them? But I think more and more now, universities are requiring some formal presentations, and I guess there's some benefits to that. It does prepare you to the inevitable presentation that you would have to do if you venture into academia later on. It also gives you a chance to talk about your work in a limited space and time, kind of like be concise of what you're saying. Okay? It also gives you a chance to explain your work to someone who is your reviewer, who may not necessarily, you know, really know about your work at this point in time.
I think that's a key point that I like, because what we try to do at the third degree is really emphasize the ability to communicate research to different audiences, and having a slightly stressful opportunity in which you can share what you're doing with people who may not be that embedded into the process is actually a good thing. Um, and then let's move on. You sort of touched upon a few areas that you look at in terms of, say, criterion as to what you want to be able to work through with each candidate during the annual review. But what kind of strategies do you as an academic employ to ensure that students understand those criterion which they're going to be evaluated on? And what can I do, or what can we all do here to think through, I know I'm going to be asked about this, I know I'm going to be asked about that, and just make sure that we psych ourselves up emotionally for it?
Yes, I think like the first thing is that it will always be scary. I think it's a reality you have to face, right? And as a stress researcher, I would always say that have no stress is bad, right? You need some level of stress, but you don't want overly stress to result in burnout. But you need some form of, it's like eating vegetables. You don't like it, but you have to do it anyway, right? So it's something that you have to face. Okay? So the annual review, you could think of it as a practice, right? Because eventually you would have to face that when you do your viva, or you go for any job interview, for instance. Okay? So one way of practicing towards that, one strategy that I do advise some of my students to do, is to practice their presentations with a friend who is not in the same field. So if you're a psychology student, maybe talk to someone in engineering or, biosciences, someone totally left field. Okay? And if they understand what you're saying, then there is a big chance that people might understand you. Years ago, I was second supervisor to a PhD student in finance. And I'm not a finance person. I can understand numbers a bit, but I'm not, I'm a psychologist. Okay. But my role in the supervision team was I was that lay person outside. So every year when he was about to do his annual review, he would walk me through his presentations on derivatives and whatnot. See, if I remember it and I understand it, then we're prepared for the next level.
Fantastic. You heard it here first. Stress is important.
Yes, stress, some level of stress.
Yeah. No, I get that. I mean, I think we all have that threshold where we try and make sure that we're able, we're sort of pressured enough to perform well. How, earlier on today, you and I also talked about the role of conferences. Not so much as a preparation tool, but as an element to where we're heading. And I sort of wanted to come up with, what you thought, or how you think presenting at a conference can actually help you refine your skills to comfortably approach a annual review session.
I mean, to me, conferences is like a gold mine, not just to refine presentation skills, but also to network, meet other PhD students or other lecturers or other researchers. It really changes your work, and it changes the way you approach your study when you go to these conferences, especially if you go for, international conferences that has quite variety. Maybe there's just that like slightly masochist side of me. The more scarier the conferences, the better. But conferences, I see it as an avenue to get free feedback, and if I see, for instance, someone who might be an expert in my field attend my session, yes, it's scary, but I see it as this is an opportunity for me to get my work, let my work become visible, to experts in the field. And even if they massacre me, it's not like I'm gonna die, or I'm gonna lose my job, or they're not grading me. Then unless they're your external examiner in the future, but at the end of the day, you're getting some free feedback from people. At the same time, it helps you build confidence, as you speak in front of people. So my first academic conference out of my PhD was a conference on work and stress, and it was in Puerto Rico. So I had to travel 27 hours to get there. Really nice venue, but really bad for jet lag. And I remember I was presenting a paper on burnout at that time. And it was my first presentation. I fumbled a lot. I'm looking back, I would be laughing. But one of the nice things that I got out of that presentation was people were actually very nice to give you feedback. And if you're open to their feedback, you realize that they're not telling you how to do your work. They're giving you suggestions, and it's up to you whether you want to use it or not. Yeah.
I think that's actually an important part. I mean, I've had much similar experiences. Conferences have been a good chance to open a discussion and then let me think through areas I can improve. I guess one of it is, look, we should never take feedback personally, whether that be from a conference, especially from the annual review. It's professional development to strengthen our research rather than a critique about, it's not saying, Craig, you're not good enough for this. It's nothing to do with that. It's just, Craig, here are opportunities. I want to know what type of feedback, we've talked about, up to now, we've talked about this from your side as an academic, somebody who's perhaps reviewing a candidate. But what advice can we give to a candidate that says, look, you're going into this experience. This is the type of feedback that you should be actively looking for. So what sort of advice might you give on the feedback that we want to seek?
I think one advice that I would actively want people to seek is to ask your reviewers, where else, what are some of the things that you think I could explore further? Ask for feedback about, areas that you are questioning. So one strategy that I've learned through the years is that rather than wait for people to ask me questions about my research, I myself ask the question and then ask the audience for it. So maybe something like, I don't understand what this particular topic is talking about. What do you think should I be? So reverse the question rather than wait for them to ask you the question that you might not know the answer to. Reverse the question and say, I'm actually not sure how to move forward in this area. Could you offer me some suggestions? And that changes the nature of the conversation most of the time, because your reviewer might suddenly think, oh, I now cannot ask that question. I now actually have to answer it.
Fantastic. What about the sort of support that we should ask? I mean, what as a candidate, I'm coming to you, I've got perhaps my first year review. What is it, or what could I say? Look, Prof, I'm struggling. I know I haven't quite met all my milestones. What type of support should I be saying, this is what I need from you? As a candidate, it's like, should I be saying I need writing support or emotional support, or what should I be looking for?
I think it's about being honest about the areas that you are struggling on, be it writing, be it emotional support, be it something that's happening in your life that could potentially affect your performance. Your supervisor's role is, to be there to give you advice. We're not going to be the ones doing your work for you, but if we don't know where you're struggling, then it's going to be difficult for us to ask for advice. So for instance, a student may want to come to me and say, I don't know how to prepare my report, and then if they come to me, I might give, okay, this is a kind of structure that, that we expect. Or someone who might be struggling with presentations. So for instance, few years back, I was reviewing someone who was clearly struggling with how to create a presentation to the point that, they were crying in the annual review, which is not something that you'd like to see when you're a reviewer. I don't like to have the reputation that Hazel made me cry, right? But I think I knew that it was a struggle for the student. So as part of her annual review, I actually gave her a task, a milestone to fulfill in time for the next review, which was, present in a conference or present in a either oral or poster, but you have to present something in public. I don't care where, and just kind of try it out there. Right? But don't be afraid to ask for support. I think some students might feel that, oh, it has nothing to do with my PhD, homesickness or someone getting ill in the family. It's nothing to do with my work. I have to go forward. Okay? But we know that extenuating circumstances might happen. And getting your supervisors aware of these needs is a good step, because your supervisor can then think of, what are within the regulations of the university that we could provide you support in.
So the key here really does come down to communication and keeping your supervisor up to date with challenges you're facing in your life, and then having a bit of openness to come into an annual review and say, look, I've got a few personal challenges at the moment.
Yeah, openness to acknowledging that you're not gonna know everything in one go, and that there will be struggles. It could even be in the simplest thing of accessing some resources. So university library might be limited, but networks might be able to support you. Like, I remember when I was a PhD student, those were the days where Google Scholar doesn't exist, right? I had to rely on, goodness, kindness of people's heart. We used to have this PsycPlatter, which was in a CD.
Yep.
So that tells you my age. It's a CD, and you just pray to the heavens that the journal that you want is in your library, right? So, but the only way I could access some of the journals were actually calling upon friends who were overseas and saying, hey, does your university have this? Would you be able to access it for me? Having that network, building your network among other PhD students would be really, really helpful.
I remember in my very early days wanting to find a particular article, and my library wasn't bad, but it just wasn't available because digitization was new. But I had a university email, and I emailed Professor Janet Lambda, who was a sociologist in family business. And I'm like, I want to get a copy. This lady actually scanned her article and a couple of others, emailed me back with it. I was just over the moon because that was the only way I figured I'm going to get anything. And it worked.
I think it's what shows there, Craig, is right. If you don't ask, you'll never know. Right.
Spot
So,
on.
being able to ask, being able to just say nicely to people. Okay?
Yeah.
And then also paying it forward later on. I think that's something. Good karma begets good karma.
I had never thought about paying it forward, but since you've raised that, I think let's have a moment on that, because I as an academic, I'm old school as well in many ways. I believe in service. We should volunteer to be reviewers. We should volunteer to be editors. We should sit on committees. And I know you've had a day of committees yesterday, so maybe I shouldn't have said that. But I do believe in that. And I think even at PhD candidate level, we've got opportunities where we can pay it forward as part of our learning experience, which kind of brings me into my next question for you, actually, is talking about professional development, because I always tell people, look, the PhD is a job. You have to structure it and operate it like a job. It's Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. You do your overtime as you like. But along with a job comes all of that professional development, the skills that I learn, the opportunities that I get to embrace during this as well. And I think it's really good to be able to think about not only have I met my milestones in my research journey, but have I actually started the professional development journey and sort of taken record, I guess, record of that journey as well. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on including that into the annual review. You know, do I come along and say, look, I taught 3 classes this semester, you know, I taught 3 different lectures this semester. It opened my eyes to this. Should I be including things like that? And how might I do that?
Well, actually, for instance, in Nottingham, our annual review consists of, looking at what training have you done. So there are what we call compulsory training, but there are also training that you and your supervisor might agree that you would need. Maybe it could be something on qualitative research, or doing something that, if you want to become an academic, doing some teaching experience. And that's forms part of the review process for us as well. To what extent have you actually undergone, professional development? So it may be a little bit off tangent to the research work that you have, but it's an integral part of it, because you need that training, you need those professional development activities to also help you move forward with your study. Right. So, and I think that's an important element, having that, like you said, treating the PhD like a job, okay, which means that you have to have some form of structure, okay, but also making sure that you also have fun at the end of it, like kind of like taking leave from time to time is important, right? And even as you do your annual review, taking rest before and after the annual review, it's not supposed to be just work, work, work all the time.
And just, you've kind of got me thinking about something. Sorry, excuse me, I'm trying to structure this as a question. So, you know that Mike and I do sessions on publishing, and we always get asked a question about, when reviewer 2 comes back, when all the reviewers come back and you've got feedback, and we talk about the need to not react to the feedback as in, this is not good, blah, blah, blah. And, they're taking it personally, but B, giving it a few days, you read it once and say, you know what, put it aside, go have that rest, go take that day or 2 off, and then come back and say, okay, what's my plan of response? Do you advocate a similar situation for the feedback that we're going to get from the annual review process?
Yes, because it's never gonna be all positive all the time. In fact, I'm scared when I get all positive reviews, because it makes you wonder, is when will the other, shoe drop, right? But when you also get negative comments, remember that it's a comment about the work, not about you as a person. And it's an excellent exercise in building self-efficacy as well. Because, when you are in a job, not everyone will like you. And as you move up the job ladder, more and more people will not like you. So, like me, I'm keeping a list of people who don't like me, and I'm putting them in my Christmas wish list of wishing them well. Right? So, but taking that, learning to compartmentalize yourself from your work and your worth as a person, I think that's important. So I do explain to my students, or even to the people that I review, that, the comments that I give you are honest feedback. They can sometimes be blunt. I can cover your work with red marks and all that, but know that I am trying to be always respectful, and also I'm doing my job as your supervisor or as your reviewer. If I don't give you an honest review, then I'm also not doing my responsibility to you, because I want my students, for instance, to be the best that they can be or be most prepared when they go to that final review, which is your viva, right?
I think a key word that I kind of want to touch on is the concept of resilience. You know, I've come out, there's a few people in the room tonight who came to my session at Nottingham on becoming a resilient researcher. And, you know, I probably chewed their ear off for a couple of hours on that topic, but I'm just wondering any other advice you have on developing resilience as an emerging academic, you know, maybe from your own personal experience, your own story as you went through the process. You know, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but I'm going to anyway. So Hazel came from a family of professors, so there's a little bit added pressure. My mum was a school teacher and my dad ran a factory. I didn't have the same pressure. Resilient, you know, my building resilience was a tad different. I'm just wondering, anything from your own personal experience, any advice on that?
I mean, I think for me personally, it's about learning to pick yourself up when you fail. You know, the first module that I taught as an academic was a module on fundamental statistics. Okay, and I remember I started my lecture telling my students that few years ago I actually failed statistics. You know, there's a fun fact about me. I was a failed math major, right? And my parents will probably be so disappointed for me to tell people that, you know, it says it lessens your, you know, credibility. But actually for me, it tells the story of how failure can actually be a catalyst for us to grow, right? So, you know, who would have thought? I don't think my lecturers would have thought that, you know, years down the line, I would be teaching statistics, and let alone be good enough to actually publish papers in statistics, right? So, and part of that is acknowledging that, you know, I didn't have a perfect start in academia. You know, I probably had a very bumpy start to it. Okay? But knowing that you really want to pursue it, you just kind of keep moving forward. And that's the same thing when you're also, you know, publishing, for instance. So one of my papers that I still go back to so often is that it took 6 revisions before it kindly got the accept, you know. And I remember the day that I got the accept, I was jumping up and down literally, because it was almost 2 years in the making from the moment that I presented it in the conference and submitted it for the journal. And looking back, there were so many steps that I could have quit. You know, it's like, no, I don't want to do it anymore. But I was lucky as well that I got good feedback from reviewers, even editors. And I was open enough to see that, hey, they're not actually out to get me, even though they're questioning, you know, almost the heart and soul of my paper. They're actually wanting me to do it better. That at one point I realized they were even telling me how to answer their questions, but it wasn't explicit. So learning how to read communications well and get other people to help you, getting, you know, collaborators and engaging with others, not being afraid to ask for help. No, I was once told that, you know, oh, hey, so you need to get a proofreader because English is not your first language. And, you know, so some, it might sound, oh, you're insulting my capability. But actually, that's why we have, you know, organizations like the Third Degree to help us with our
Yeah,
language. Right?
exactly. It's about getting a second set of eyes.
Yeah, because
So,
sometimes you write something, you read something over and over again. It's
yeah.
almost like you just gloss through it, right?
When I did an exercise 10 years after I did my master's degree, I printed out a copy and I proofread it. Every single page had marks and notations and changes. I don't even want to look at that. But I do know how far I've come then to now. I wanted to touch on something else again, not in our actual chosen questions for tonight, but you've touched on an area, and I think with resilience, um, I like I advocate very strongly for having a mentor. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, not on having a mentor, I think we're going to align pretty well on that, but on, spending a bit of time with your mentor before your annual review to talk through some of the issues. What do you feel about that?
I mean, I had very unique mentors in my supervisors. My master supervisor basically founded psychology in the Philippines. So I was named after him. So by the time he was my supervisor, he was like in his 80s. So we had one supervision session and he only told me, just do it, Hazel. but but he knew my conversations with him were more of like developmental. My PhD mentor was also very much hands off. Hazel, you know what you want to do. Come to me
Yeah.
if you need it. Okay? But I realized, moving forward with my career, it was important to have that conversation with peers. And I think having that conversation before your annual review with someone that you might have as a research mentor, even just a peer, just to bounce off ideas, help you practice, what you want to say. I sometimes do that. I talk to myself in the mirror. It sounds funny, but it helps you practice in your head what is it that you want to say to others and edit yourself as you go along the way. It will still not be probably the answer you give to someone later on in the annual review, but it is, it helps a lot in my view.
I I like the idea of editing yourself because I find myself doing that forever. I construct emails and conversations in my head 3 days before I write them down or do anything with them. But by the time I've come to that point, I've sharpened what I wanted to say right down to being as accurate as I possibly can. And I
And don't
found that was a brilliant skill to have developed. It's taken me 30 something years, but I'm better than I used to be at that.
Yeah, and also like what you said about constructing things, editing yourself, right? Don't send out something when you are very emotional, for
Yeah.
instance. When you're angry, just draft something and
So,
then go back to it.
so that actually that kind of resonates with the I want to say the no cry policy you and Mike had sort of suggested to me before, but how how do I go about tempering my emotion during a meeting? Because I know it can be emotional. You're coming through, you're listening, people are asking you questions, and you might not have an answer. How should I sort of try to prepare myself mentally in advance to be able to just let things go over my head and say, okay, I'll work on that. Okay, thank you for the feedback, but not to sort of become defensive. I imagine if I come in, I'm talking with you about my progress and you give me some negative feedback. I'm like, well, I think you're wrong, Hazel. That's not gonna be a productive thing, right? So any advice on just how to handle one's communication, body language, response during the review itself?
Well, one of the things is that, that saying fake it until you make it. It works a bit like that. When you go to your presentation to review, you smile at people. You pretend to be confident even if you're not confident. And that kind of sends a signal already to your audience that, oh, this person might know what they're saying. Someone had once advised me that when you're speaking in front of a crowd and you don't know them and they look scary, just imagine that they're all naked in front of you or they're all dressed up as clowns, and unless of course you're afraid of clowns.
For distinguished professors, that may scare a few people off too.
Yeah, so but I think also understanding that the people in front of you are also human beings.
Yeah.
So, watching out for their body language, getting them and not letting them see that you're annoyed. Someone once told me that the best revenge you can give to your, scary coworkers is to let not to let them see that they're getting to you. Okay?
Yeah.
So it must be more annoying for someone who's trying to poke your work and just smiling, okay, thank you very much.
I like that. I mean, I think you're right actually, because there is a form of intimidation, and intimidation only works if the person who's intimidating actually feels like they are doing that. If you're able to put that mask on and work your way through it, as hard as that is, especially the first time, it's actually not a bad thing.
I think, I guess for us Asians, it can be challenging, especially when
Hmm.
you're talking to people who are more senior than you. I
Yeah.
remember during it was my final viva when I was asked by one of my examiners why I didn't analyze a particular variable. But I
Hmm.
remember distinctively that this was a variable that the examiners asked me to exclude in the preliminary viva. So I just
Okay.
cheekily replied, because you told me not to include it. But I said it in a way that I sounded like innocent. Like I said something like, because you told me not to do it, but I have the data if you want me to include it now. And it kind of caught them that, oops, yeah, we forgot about it. So you remain respectful, but at the same time honest, and also challenge. It takes practice. Maybe I'm just kind of like the kind of person who was always vocal about what I wanted. Okay. And also I served them nice food. So all my nervousness went into cooking
That
rather
would have
than
worked. Yep. So
so
you sort of
displacement was important to me.
you touched on the it may be an Asian thing. So let me go down that rabbit warren for a couple of minutes. And I just sort of wanted to talk about the challenges or opportunities that doctoral candidates from different societies have, whether it be Asian, whether it be African, whether it be North American, Pacific Island. And I'm just wondering if you've got any sort of observations on either the challenges or opportunities for supporting candidates who, let's just say international students for our
I
case.
I think like one very inherent challenge that I notice is sometimes students, especially for my international students from the Asian region, is that we tend to say yes all the time to what the reviewers want. So I do tell my students part of a viva or a review is a defense. And a defense means you put forward your ideas. You just say, yes, 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 I'll do it. Right? Because one of the things as a reviewer I look for is the ability of my student, of the student to actually stand their ground and tell me, hey, I think my idea is better. And that can be scary. So I do tell my PhD students, for instance, defend, but defend with respect. So be open to feedback, but also know that, that you can also say, hey, I think this is better. Or, what about this particular perspective? Because your reviewers are coming from a particular perspective that they may not be familiar with what you're saying. So that's one. It's about the ideas. Another challenge I feel is communication, language, especially for those whose English is not their first language. Unfortunately, our theses are all going to be in English. So if you're not able to communicate well, it can be sometimes more daunting because it could frustrate your reviewer, especially if you're not understanding what they're trying to say. Okay, so we do tell reviewers, for instance, and as PhD supervisors, we are reminded that we shouldn't be judging someone on the basis of their ability to write perfect English. Okay,
Yeah.
but as a student yourself, when you know that that is a weak area for you, actively try and improve upon it.
Yeah.
Talking to others, communicating to others in English, practicing your writing, those are little things that you can do, right?
Okay. You talked about defending with respect, and I wanted to add a couple of words to that, if I may, because that's something that I talk about as well, but I also say, and evidence, because, you know, one, it's our PhD. We should be in the driver's seat. And I know we're both in agreement on that. And, you know, respectfully challenging a supervisor or respectfully challenging somebody who's giving you feedback that's kind of putting you in a different direction still comes down to also saying, but have a look at this article. This actually suggests that my approach is right. What's your opinion on that? And like you with the throwing the question back, I look at that as well, because you should never walk into an argument without ammunition that is valuable for you. It's not about I have to win. It's about saying, well, I read here that this approach seems to be. Is there a counter argument that you have seen to that?
Yeah, I
So
think
that's sort of
that's
something I think
important,
about.
right? I think that's important, having that discourse. So like
Yes.
when you come into the conversation, the more evidence that you have, the easier it will be for you to support your discourse. So part of your challenge in doing a review or any paper is you have to convince your reader that your point of view is the best way, you know, or the most logical, plausible way of moving forward. But if you come in without evidence to support it, then your reviewer will be able to shut you down almost immediately, right? So sometimes reviewers will ask questions that they already know the answer to, but they're just testing your knowledge. So, and again, that's about knowing what is it that you're studying. You know, at the end of the day, you're the expert on your thesis.
Exactly. And that comes down to what I asked earlier about professional development. It's developing the skills to be able to stand up for yourself, to be able to say, well, you know, I respect that what you're saying is fair, but I also have a different perspective, and being able to stand your ground
Yeah,
and
stand the
and
ground.
say, look, this is how I view it.
And also be honest, you know, sometimes you really don't know how to answer the question, you
Yeah.
know, so it's about balancing that, right? So you can't just say, I don't know the answer all the time, because that's not going to be good for you,
Yeah,
right?
I can imagine you're in a review and every question is, I don't know. You don't need to be here. This
Yeah, I mean, I was reviewing a PhD candidate once, and our question was, could you tell us about your PhD? What is it about? And the person just froze and he couldn't answer it, right? And
Oh,
the review, as reviewers, we were like, okay, so what do we do next, right? And you try to kind of like, you know, help the student. So I
yeah,
mean, as much as your reviewers can be scary, reviewers are generally helpful. You know, it doesn't give us joy to actually see the student fail. You know, like for me, an approach and a review is it should move the project to the next stage rather than stop the project from moving forward, because it's not gonna make me any better professor if people fail, right? But it
yeah,
would be nice to see them succeed, right?
yeah, indeed. Well, that kind of brings me into my last question before we open it up to the floor. How can a student, I mean, I like the idea you want to see everybody succeed. I agree with that. I think that's part of our role. We're there to nurture, but not handhold nurture,
Yeah.
but encourage. Um, Through the process of a review, how do we, or how can we help our students, our research candidates, leverage the feedback we give during the annual review, but to help them inform both their research trajectory and their academic journey? I really want to say their career path in a way. You know, I think you know I'm heading towards that aspect. But you know, moving forward, how do we take it and use this to help define our future? Because in some respect, it should be a contribution to defining our future, right?
Yeah. I think like when I look at feedback that I receive during review, for instance, I would compartmentalize it into several categories. One is what can I immediately address? So it's almost like when you write the paper, right? When you get review, what's it that I can actually address within the time frame of my thesis, right? What is something that I could probably explore post-thesis, right? And that's something that you might say to the reviewer later on. I'll explore it, but I don't think I have the resources to do it now. And what is actually not feasible to do. So having that judgment to see what you can take now, what is doable and what is not doable. And look at that as both acknowledgement of your strength as a researcher. So these are the things I can acknowledge, but also realizing that, hey, I have limitations as well. If my reviewers ask me to collect data again when I'm already in my write-up year, will it actually add value to my thesis or to my career? Then if your answer is no, then you just tell the reviewers, I'm sorry, thank you, but I'm sorry, I am not in the position to do that, right?
I think that final one takes a little bit of guts, though, to be able to sort of push back, but I think that's fair.
Yeah, it takes time, I think, Craig, to learn
Yeah.
how to push back, So it's not something that I would expect someone new in academia to do all the time. But, getting to know your reviewers, getting to know your supervisor, building a relationship with them wherein there's an element of trust and honesty, having that what we call the academic contract in place as you start your PhD journey. I think that's important. Right?
Yes. No, I appreciate that. I've really enjoyed the chat tonight. I'm going to hand over to Farrell in a moment for a Q&A session, just to see if there are questions from the floor. Any questions for Hazel about the process, about thinking through, or to be honest, if I can open it up a bit wider, about succeeding as an early career academic would be great. I really do appreciate your time, the insights. I'm glad we did it as a fireside because we both know that every university is going to be different. But hearing stories, I think is a very valuable thing. I actually have a question, but I'm hoping to open it up to the floor first before I ask my question. So, Farrell, it's over to you if there are questions.
No questions so far. Everyone's very quiet today.
Azra, do you have a question? I know you normally do. I'm hoping you do tonight. She just disappeared off the screen. No.
Let's throw her in a deep end.
I know, that's terrible of me. Oh, she's back. I mean, please, if there are questions, if you want a different perspective on something, please do ask Hazel. While you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to ask a question. It's a tiny bit off topic, but I think in a way it's not off topic, okay, if it kind of makes sense. I always talk to students about the need to develop a sense of intuition when we do our research. When we look at some data and we see something that doesn't seem right, that our mind says to us, you know what, that really doesn't seem right. It's not reporting the facts, it's uncovering, digging up a little bit further, trying to see, if it doesn't feel quite intuitive to you, that you need to do a bit further. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
I mean, I think it's important. The way for us to develop that questioning critical mind is really reading widely. You can never read enough for your research. And I think it will also come to a point where you just have to say, okay, I'm going to let it go for now. Because I guess if you read it again, you will never run out of questions. So coming to your research with a curious mind, and just asking yourself, is this the only way of answering this problem? And there's nothing wrong with asking questions. I think it's not being disrespectful if you ask your supervisor a question, so I think we have to encourage people to ask questions, even if they do sound dumb sometimes. So I do tell my students in my class, there are no dumb questions in my class. Okay? But I do tell you if your questions doesn't make sense to me, or I don't know how to answer your question.
I think it comes back to our discussion, giving back. There are lots of dumb questions. At the end of the day, as PhD candidates, many of us will become academics, and many of us will have to go through that with our own students. So there's kind of a rite of passage there as well. But if it gives you an insight, or if it helps you, I might see two things that I can't see a connection with. You might say one sentence and suddenly it joined together. I was at a presentation last year on big data and creative research methods, and the two have always been very separate for me. Somebody put up one visual. I'm like, oh shit, I got it. And I now understand how I can bring qualitative creative methods overlapped with big data and get some fantastic results. I'm like, well, that's a whole new world for me. And it just took one visual to do that. So,
And I think
I would have
you
been
also,
there asking a dumb question, to be honest.
yeah. And you never know how much impact you can make on a person, right? So, a tiny bit of help moves a lot. So I remember a couple of months back, I received a random email from some PhD student in a different university asking to help fill out a questionnaire that they had.
Yeah.
And so I clicked on the link because I have this philosophy that if anyone asks me for help with data, I will say yes, unless I really don't have time,
We're
because
putting
that was a
Hazen's
big-
email address in the chat box for you now, people.
so even because when I was a PhD student and a master's student, I wouldn't have been able to collect those data if I didn't have people who helped me, right?
Agreed.
So this particular student emailed me and I was like, okay, I'm gonna answer the questionnaire, but it wasn't in English. It was in a foreign language. And so I just kind of like, I said, you know what? I could choose to just ignore this because I cannot understand it, or I could write back. So I wrote back the candidate and say, hey, I think you have an interesting questionnaire here, but unfortunately, it is not in English. And if you want to target, a wider community, you might want to have your questionnaire translated. So I got an email back from the person a couple of hours later. So apparently he did have an English translation, but he didn't realize that he didn't put it in the link that he was sending out. And he was so thankful that, somebody pointed it out to him. And to me, that's my little contribution to your research, because he would have missed out on people who could actually answer his questionnaire, but were unable to do so because of the language. Right?
That's actually a great story, and I think it gives us a lot of hope, because I do believe most academics are actually very generous and are appreciative of the journey, and that they will help people. So I think it is good to hear that. I don't know, are there any questions from the group? Is this going to be our first time ever in 3 years when nobody's asked a question?
Yeah, no questions so far, surprisingly.
Either my students are scared of me right now, or they're
Yeah,
reviewing a
yeah, they talk to me when I come out to campus. So no, I think that's perfectly fine if nobody has a question. Okay, Edward has a
Alright.
question. Okay.
Hey,
What's up?
this is Edward. He goes, hi, Edward. Edward goes, I want to know for the first year annual present, should I also include the preliminary story or not?
Well, it depends on the school, whether it's required or not. So for instance, at Nottingham, you are not expected to have a preliminary pilot study at the annual review, especially if it's empirical, because you're not expected to do empirical data in the first year. But let's say you've done a systematic literature review, that kind of thing. And if it adds value, then do present it. Right? There's no harm in presenting something, just be open to the feedback that your reviewer would probably give you, because they might steer you to a different direction completely.
I think if I can extrapolate that to general advice, yeah, there's no harm in putting it forward and discussing it and getting some thoughts on it. If it's done, again, it's the professional development. I've done this, I've developed those skills. And much like our conference discussion, we can get some legitimate feedback on it that might say, you know what, this is promising, or oh, you wasted a bit of time, maybe you can do it differently. I know that's kind of, we may get negative, but I do feel that there is value in giving it a go and just showcasing that you've made attempts, even if it's not something that would be expected from that process.
Yeah, so like if you've done, let's say, a publication in the first year, or, within the year, it's something that you also have to showcase that, it's an achievement, right?
Yeah.
I know in some universities, they do require that you publish up to a certain, we're fortunate in Nottingham, we encourage you to publish, but we don't expect it, right?
Yeah. That's a hard one. I'm working with a couple of students who must publish in order to get their doctorate, and they're right at the end of that rope. And so, okay. Are there any other questions, ladies and gentlemen?
No, so far no.
Okay. Then
Hello?
Oh, wait, hold on. There's a question. Hello.
Yep.
Yes, so can I speak?
Sure.
Here?
Go
Sure.
for it, Edwin.
Okay.
Hey, gonna
Good,
turn your
yeah, this
camera
is-
on, my friend. No?
Okay, yes, wait a moment. Good. Yeah. Yeah. So, yes, no?
We can't see you yet.
I know,
Never
I'm
mind,
not
just
setting.
go ahead with the question.
Okay. My setting have some problem. But anyway, yeah, I have still first I would like to say thanks to Dr. Greg and also Dr. Hazer to provide this very useful, valuable chance for us. Yeah. Okay, this is Edward. Yeah, I'm the fresh PhD student. Okay. Actually, now I'm preparing for my annual review, especially recently I'm writing my literature review. Okay. So I spent a lot of time on my literature review, and suddenly I aware that I collected a lot of opinions or studies or findings for only others. Somehow I'm thinking about should I also put some kind of my opinion in it or not? Although I know maybe literature review from my understanding point is okay to collect the others' opinion, right? But subconsciously, somehow during my writing, I always intend to say, okay, have some my own opinion in it. So I want to know is it correct or maybe say not correct. I should really focus on the existing literature, what they already have. So I should put away my opinions first, and I should express or do it in the later phase. So this is my question to Dr. Hazer.
I mean, full disclosure, Edward is my student. So thank you,
I was
Edward,
waiting
for
for
moving
that.
forward. Yes, Edward, and I know
Yeah.
Edward's preparing very well for his annual review. But I think, in a literature review, it's more than just writing what others have done before. It also showcases your understanding of what others have done and what are your interpretations of it. So yes, there is gonna be room for your own opinion, I think. But what makes your opinion strong is that if you're able to substantiate it with the evidence from the literature. So it's about I guess not just summarizing, but critically bringing together the different ideas and saying, okay, based on my readings, this is how I understand it. Okay. So in the annual review, it's not going to be your final literature review. In fact, until the day you submit your thesis, several years down the line, it can still change, right? It's just at this point in time, this is your understanding of the literature, the gaps, and so on, and you let your reviewer examine that further.
If you're going to allow me, I'm going to add my 2 cents on this one, Hazel. And feel free to say, you know what, Craig, I think I disagree, because we might a little bit. I actually want to change the word opinion, because, you know, when we think about opinion, it's like, I don't like this. It's not, you use the term substantiate, which is so important, because many of us can have an opinion without actually having a reason behind it. And I would much rather Edward use the word perspective, because it is about perspective. It's our whole understanding as an emerging academic on something. So I think it's stronger than an opinion. I'm of the mindset, I actually agree with everything that Hazel said there. So, you know, we're not too far off the tracks in this case. I'm of the mindset that, look, you know, having that perspective and being able to talk about it is an important skill to develop. But I'm also of the same mindset, you know, it's like juggling. Having that mindset and then expressing it doesn't always have to correlate in the same activity. At a point where I'm in my first review, I might be more likely to withhold a few perspectives and see what people say, let the discussion grow, and then say, oh, I thought about this, rather than putting it out there. So to me, it's about being prepared to have that discussion without necessarily having to have that discussion. That's kind of how I would approach this. You know, I'm not sure whether you're...
I think it's almost like you're trying to bait your reader to become more interested, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to give them all the goods at the same time, all in
Well,
one go.
I think it comes down to also, look, get the feedback first before I'm ready to step a little bit deeper into the quagmire. But when I get the feedback and I've got something intelligent to say, then out comes that perspective. So, but I thought about it from this perspective as well, rather than it's like playing cards. You don't show all of your hand or your facial expression before you see what your opponents are doing. And you know, I don't want to use the word opponent, but we don't need to share everything straight away, but we need to be prepared to have that conversation.
Very good metaphor. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Edward. And by the way, Edward, good luck for your review, which is coming up. I know you've got that quite soon. I'm pretty sure you're going to do really well.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions? If not,
hold it. Oh, sorry. Azra has got internet issues. Do you have any questions, Azra?
There's a recording for it, Azra, which I'll make available soon enough. So you haven't missed out.
Yeah. Internet is one of a challenge that you face if you do your annual review online, you know.
Yes.
Be prepared for some internet hiccups. You know, sometimes your supervisor will be more scared of that. You know, having backup phones is important.
Well, if there are no more questions, Hazel, let me say thank you very much for joining me tonight, contributing to what we're doing. Really appreciate your insights, really appreciate your time. And it's also been fun because we've had a lot of conversations over the last year, but we've never actually done anything formal. So that's really cool for me. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, you're welcome to send them to me. I will certainly forward them on to Hazel. If Hazel's willing, she's more than welcome. You're more than welcome, Hazel, to put your LinkedIn address in the chat box for anybody who might want to connect with you. If you don't, we're okay with that too.
I would love to, but I just don't know how to do it.
Let me
If
do it. Let me
anybody
see what I
wants
can do.
to connect to Hazel, let me know and I'll give you her LinkedIn
Yes.
address. That'll be easier. So on behalf of the Third Degree, on behalf of everybody here tonight, thank you very much. We're not one of these modern places that give certificates of appreciation. You just get my thank you and I'll buy you a coffee. But really do appreciate. And thank you everybody for joining. Next week,